Hi everyone, thank you all for tuning in. I'm here to report on the insanity phase of the Dana Rivers trial. For those of you who don't remember or don't know, Dana Rivers was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and arson in the first phase of the trial. And then we moved on to the second phase of the trial, which is to determine whether or not Dana Rivers was legally sane or insane at the time of the murders. If Rivers were declared insane, he would have spent his sentence in a mental health facility instead of a prison. And I think there would have been more discretion given to the doctors to determine if he could be released at some point. So that's basically what the sanity phase is about determining how Rivers will spend his sentence. And I have to give a full disclosure here that I actually was not able to attend in person the witness testimony. So they had 3 witnesses come, 3 mental health professionals, doctors, who evaluated Rivers' mental health state. And apparently what happened is 2 of them decided he was not insane, that is, he was sane, and 1 of them decided that he was insane. I did go on, it was Tuesday, January 3rd, I went to the closing remarks. And so I heard what both the prosecutor and defense were saying about the testimony. So I can report on that. When I came on Tuesday, January 3rd, the first thing that happened was that the prosecution actually wanted to motion for a directed verdict. I wasn't entirely clear what that meant. It's sort of a way of trying to draw the trial to a close early, I think. She said there wasn't enough evidence for the insanity defense, but the judge seemed confused as well and said normally a motion for directed verdict is done when there's a jury present, and that way they can dismiss the jury and just have the judge decide. But in this case, the jury had already been dismissed. Dana Rivers had already requested that this be determined by the judge rather than the jury. So the motion for directed verdict was kind of pointless. But anyway, that's how it began on Tuesday. Then they actually moved on to the closing statements. And it began with the defense giving her closing statement because it's actually the burden of proof is on the defense to prove insanity. And so what happened is defense attorney sort of begins by sort of pointing out how Rivers was for most of his life was actually a good citizen who only started to have mental health problems after leaving his last job. And she also made the case that Rivers showed signs of not acting rationally at the scene of the crime. So, for example, he ran off or tried to run off with the cell phone of one of the victims, but did not run off with the guns. Apparently, he sort of walked around the neighborhood for a while or walked around the block before returning to the scene of the crime. Once again, according to the defense, this was irrational behavior. The defense also tried arguing that it wasn't that Rivers was planning this crime in advance by going online and buying all this gun equipment. That what was really going on is that he may have been a super hyper vigilant veteran who was a bit paranoid and wanted to go to Charlotte Reed's house in order to somehow protect them. And that something about his PTSD was triggered, and he had some fit of rage and ended up committing the murders. So she was arguing it was done in a moment of insanity. It wasn't really a pre-planned thing. And then she talks about the testimony of the 3 alienists or psychiatrists that were there. She says that we should dismiss the testimony of Dr. Howard, who I think testified electronically, or maybe it was that he evaluated Rivers electronically or something like that. Anyway, she was trying to insinuate that he didn't really have good a good evaluation of Rivers, and that also he himself was kind of a bit nutty and narcissistic and not reliable. And so she said we should look at Dr. Watt, who was so Dr. Howard, who I just mentioned, thought that Rivers was was sane. The defense says, okay, now let's look instead at Dr. Watt and Dr. Griffith, who disagreed about whether or not Rivers was sane. Dr. Watt said Rivers was sane. Griffith said Rivers was insane. And she is sort of trying to prod people to agree with Dr. Griffith's evaluation, saying that he has more experience with veterans with PTSD, and that Rivers gave him more detailed answers than he gave Watt. And so that was the defense's argument. The prosecution begins by once again rehashing some of the evidence about the Deviants motorcycle club and the texts that were given that seemed to incriminate Rivers. She also says, actually Rivers was acting perfectly rationally at the scene of the crime. Yes, he didn't run off with the guns, but that was because the guns weren't in his name and didn't have his DNA. While as the bloody knife, which did have his DNA, he did run off with, for example. She also then goes to look at the alienists. She defends Dr. Howard against the defense attorney, saying that he actually was quite experienced with PTSD, veterans with PTSD, and that we should trust his judgment that Rivers was sane. She also says that Dr. Griffith, who was the one alienist who said he was insane, that he didn't really have all the evidence at hand. So he based his verdict entirely on interviews with Rivers, but didn't know some of the other factors that were involved. For example, he didn't know the gun had a silencer or that the victims were killed in their PJs, which would suggest sort of premeditation, a sort of rational premeditation in advance, and he admitted that he didn't take that into consideration with his decision. A prosecutor really wanted to highlight Dr. Watt because she gave the most comprehensive evaluation to Rivers and decided he was sane. The prosecution also brings up that it's extraordinarily rare for PTSD to be used as for the insanity defense. So it was PTSD as the mental illness that they were trying to use to say Rivers was acting legally insane, but that's very rarely used in insanity defense cases. And when it is successful, what happens is the argument is that the criminal had some triggering flashback of the PTSD causing incident at the scene of the crime. And that incident just sets them off and triggers the crime. The problem is there's no evidence of that in Rivers' case. Dana Rivers insists that he didn't even have much of a memory of the crime itself. There's no evidence that Rivers reported being triggered by something at the murders, even though Dr. Watt gave all these cognitive tests to Rivers that suggested that Rivers had a very good memory overall. So that's kind of suspicious. If Rivers had a very good memory overall, but does not recall a PTSD triggering incident at the scene of the crime, that really calls into question the insanity defense. Another thing that's brought up are the phone calls that Dana Rivers made. Apparently, Dana Rivers made a call to his brother saying that he had never felt more control than as he did the night of the murders, which once again suggests he was sane. According to the prosecution, he also made some very incriminating phone calls from Santa Rita prison. For example, he made some call indicating that he only wanted to go to Napa for mental health evaluation because he just wanted a lighter sentence and not because he actually felt like he was mentally unwell. There was also one really incriminating phone call, which said that he only makes decisions with full knowledge of their consequences. So I think that was some very thought-provoking testimony about the phone calls. And as it turned out, so then on Thursday, I guess it's January 5th, as it turns out, the judge agreed with the prosecution that Rivers was legally sane. And he seemed particularly impressed by Dr. Watt's testimony to that effect. So the insanity defense failed, looked like it was finally over, but then we find out from the defense attorney that Rivers is planning on essentially declaring this a mistrial and wants a new trial. This is typical in these really serious cases where the suspect could end up with life in prison, that they throw all these Hail Marys to try to get off somehow. So this shouldn't really be a huge shock. It just does mean that, there's going to be more delay. Probably won't be till late spring that we'll have a verdict on whether or not this is going to be redone with another trial. What's going to happen is that it's going to go to a public defender, and the public defender is going to decide if the defense attorney gave bad legal counsel to Rivers in such a way that would render Rivers eligible for another trial. It's probably not going to happen, but it is annoying that there's still this delay, because otherwise Rivers could be sentenced within 20 days, but not because of this. It's also probably, even if there's no mistrial, there'll probably be an appeal at some point. And one of the things that's likely going to be brought up is this whole shenanigans about how apparently what happened is the defense attorney served some subpoenas to the Veterans Hospital employees that treated Rivers, but the Veterans Administration claims they weren't properly submitted, but the defense attorney thinks they were and made a petition to the judge so that they could take it to the federal courts to demand that the VA come and testify, but the judge turned down that request. So this might be something that's going to be brought up at some point, either in the mistrial or the appeals process, whether or not there was some problem with getting the Veterans Administration there, because I think the defense really wanted those VA witnesses there, but was unable to get them. So that might be one thing to look out for. So it's kind of a drag that there isn't really just, we can say, formal closure quite yet. My heart goes out to the families of the victims in particular, because it must be really hard to have to wait this long about it. But I don't think that there's going to be a new trial. I don't think that the appeals process is going to amount to much. I think the evidence is just too overwhelming. But in any case, like I said, probably not until late spring till we know more about the potential second trial verdict, when they'll decide whether or not it'll go to another trial. The process will probably begin again on January 31st. That's when maybe they'll find a public defender or something. But otherwise, that's that. That's the end of the second phase, the insanity phase. So anyway, thanks everyone for watching. I think it's an important case, and I'm glad there's some people out there who are interested. So thank you.